Good evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online with Charles Blow talking about his New York Times bestseller, The Devil You Know. I'm Ariel Zeitlin, a librarian at Montclair Public Library, and here are a few housekeeping details. Okay, thank you, Molly. Whether you're using a phone, a tablet, or a computer, you have the same controls in GoToWebinar. Here's the question mark or chat box, which is your link to me and my librarian co-host, Molly Hone, during the webcast. You can use it to get live tech help from Molly, and you'll also use it to send us your questions for the author Q&A at the end. Thanks, Molly. Now, I'd like to introduce Gina Chung Fort, a member of the board of our foundation. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you. We're so happy you're all here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money to fund the offerings that make our library so special. This includes library programs like this one, staff development, building restoration, and other needs that aren't covered by city funding. Your donations support everything from laptop lending and Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access, to the delivery of materials to seniors who are at home, to the children's reading programs, and most recently, the significant growth in e-content during the pandemic. In these unprecedented times, the Montclair Public Library remains a constant. Unfortunately, this year, because of the pandemic, the town has held back more than $500,000 in library funding. The result is the library has had to cut staff, eliminate weekend hours, close the Bellevue branch, and more. We know you'd like to see your library flourish again, so please make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org, after you enjoy this event. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for all that you do, Gina. And for everyone in the audience, if you're looking for another way to support the library, please consider joining the Montclair Library Friends. They're a group of passionate, dedicated library users who advocate on our behalf, and they're looking for new members. If you're interested in learning more, please visit our website or search Montclair Library Friends on Facebook. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Charles Blow. Welcome, Charles. Charles is going to be here in 1 minute.
I did it.
Yay. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Charles Blow needs no introduction to most of you because you've been reading his op-ed columns in the New York Times twice a week since 2008. He specializes in the subjects of social justice, racial equality, presidential politics, police violence, gun control, and the Black Lives Matter movement. You may also have attended Charles's first appearance on Open Book, Open Mind back in 2015 when he came to promote his memoir, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which has since been adapted for the stage by the Metropolitan Opera. Charles sometimes refers to himself as a Black son of the South because he was born, raised, and educated in Louisiana. He currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. We're delighted to welcome him back to Montclair, albeit virtually. Charles's latest book, The Devil You Know, was just published a few days ago and is already on the New York Times bestseller list. It's available to borrow from the library and to purchase from our partner, Watchung Booksellers. Here's what NPR has to say about it. The Devil You Know is Charles Blow's own radical declaration of radical thought. Throughout the book, Blow grounds his ideas in this central question: what could and should Black people do to acquire and maintain the economic and political power for the many, not just for the few, that the Great Migration failed to secure? Now, I'm very pleased to introduce Charles's conversation partner, Jim Johnson. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you so much. It's good to see both of you.
Jim Johnson is the former chair of the Brennan Center for Social Justice and current chief corporation counsel of the legal department of New York City. He served as Undersecretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration and was the 2017 Democratic candidate for governor of New Jersey. Jim is a native of Montclair, New Jersey, and a great supporter of the library. We're happy to have you back. Okay, so this is the moment we've all been waiting for. I'll be back to read the questions for our audience Q&A, and for all of you at home, please remember that you can start submitting your questions while the conversation is going on. And now I can't wait to hear what happens next.
All right. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you to the foundation for supporting this phenomenal institution. If you want a sense of return on the investment, you're looking at it. I got my first library card when I was 6 years old in 1967 from the Montclair Public Library. And I've been happy to have a card ever since. So Charles, thank you for coming back to the library. Thank you for writing another phenomenal book. I enjoyed our talk last time. I enjoyed the book last time. And I like the continuation of the journey. So the book that you've written is, to me, many things. It's extraordinarily rich. I've always loved the way that you use the language. And more importantly, it's trenchant. It is a call to action for basically racial justice. And it is a myth-breaking book. I like the way you use data to make your case. The lawyer in me likes the way you make your closing arguments. But finally, I think it's more than that. For me, there's a lot of love in this book. It starts from the very beginning, and it is traceable throughout. You have a voice that makes me just want to sink into it, and I did, and I'm grateful for that. I don't want to start, though, at the beginning. I actually want to start at the end. The last chapter, the last section where you talk about the reunion, basically a coming home. Could you talk a little bit about what we would be coming home to if African Americans moved in larger numbers to the South, and why we should seek to make that journey?
Well, the last chapter is really about culture, not as much about power, which is what the rest of the book is about. And I describe that benefit in culture as additive, as an extra benefit for reverse migration. You have to remember that for the vast majority of the time that Black people have been on this soil, we've always lived in the South. The majority of Black people always lived in the South. Most of that time, up until the Great Migration, 90% of Black people lived in the South. It is rich with Black culture. Our oldest Black institutions are still in the American South. If one food kind of historian talks about Southern food is Black food. It is food largely brought to America by the enslaved, cooked by the enslaved, and kind of nurtured by that. But Southern music is, to a large degree, Black African music. Even country western, even the banjo is an African invention. Even though people associate it with hillbillies and the white South, it is a Black instrument. And so there's just a lot of richness in the South for Black people, and it wasn't that Black people ever wanted to leave the South. The Civil War was over for 50 years and Black people still stayed in the South. In fact, during the enslavement of Black people in this country, the majority of freed Blacks lived in the South, not the North. So it became a displaced ancestral land. It became the place in this country that was most ours, that we were most tied to. And both the idea of legacy and lineage, but also in terms of culture, and the culture being split, by basically cleaved in half by the Great Migration. And there's some amazing things that happen in destination cities. These are the cities I call that people migrated to. Amazing things happen there, but amazing things happen in the South as well. The lion's share of the civil rights movement was orchestrated and conducted by Southern Black people, right? People, they got help from other places, they got finance from other places, but it was their bodies in the breach. It was their intellectuals that gave that movement moral verve. So that both, I always say that there's two Black Americas, sons and daughters of the Great Migration and sons and daughters, the ones who stayed. I believe they both have things that are complementary, and that Black people in general would benefit from them coming back together.
So my family, the most recent of my family members to move up from the South moved up more than 100 years ago. And in Montclair, in the cemetery in Montclair in the South End, because that's Montclair was very segregated when I was growing up. In the South End, there are 4 generations of my family buried. But they brought the South with them. My grandparents brought the South with them in the way we spoke to each other, in the food that we ate, and they built lives here. Why leave? Why leave the North and go South?
Well, the book is a proposition for political power, and you have to ask yourself whether or not you're experiencing political power where you are. I lived in New York for 26 years. New York State has never produced a Black senator, even though there are 2 million Black people in New York City, 3 million in the state. New York City has produced 1 Black governor, and only because he was the lieutenant governor when the governor got into a prostitution scandal. They produced a handful of state representatives all in and around New York City. So how much power do you have? Even in the city where you are 2.1 million of the population, you've had 1 Black mayor, and that was 30 years ago, and he was followed by Giuliani, who we now see was a raving lunatic, and he was followed by Michael Bloomberg, who championed stop and frisk.
Some of us were on to Giuliani back when he was the mayor, for sure. And so, what do we gain, and how do we gain it if we were decided to move? And how many people do you think would be necessary to have the sort of impact that you're talking about?
Right. So at the end of the Civil War, 3 southern states were majority Black: Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina. Another 3 were within 4 percentage points of being majority Black. Every state in the South had large percentages of Black people. If Black people had not migrated, it is possible, it's a big if, clearly, but it is possible that Black people could control up to 14 Senate seats. They could control more electoral college votes than New York State and California combined. If the Voting Rights Act had still passed and Black people voted over that period the same way that they vote now, you wouldn't have had a Republican governor, Republican president for the last 50 years or so, I think. And I don't think there's a single person on the Supreme Court who was appointed over that 50 years ago. So the entire complexion of the Supreme Court would be different than it is now. And if you want a more recent example, if Hillary Clinton had simply won the southern states that she won in the primaries, those with heavily Black populations, she could have lost every single one of the Midwestern swing states, and she would still have been president. What taking more of a role in states or being the majority of a state means is enormous. Right now, there are 1,200 majority Black cities in America. 90% of them are in the South, but there are no cities in the Constitution. The Constitution splits power between federal and state. As far as the Supreme Court is concerned, as far as the Constitution is concerned, for the most part, cities exist at the behest of states. That's why anything that a city wants to do that the state doesn't like, they can preempt. You want real power, you have to be part of that duality of power sharing between the federal government and the states. And that means you have to take over a state.
And you've gone through a series of counterfactuals. You've identified if we had these states, then the following several things would have happened. But one of the powerful things about your book is not just the counterfactuals, it is the myth busting that you do, the exegesis of race relations in the North as compared to race relations in the South. And I think it would be helpful if, as we're having this discussion, because this part of your book is about the push, you talked a little bit about how the lack of power in the North manifests itself in the experience of African Americans in the North as opposed to the South.
Well, yes, I mean, two biggest states in America, well, two of the biggest states, California and New York. New York has one majority Black city, Yonkers. California has 0 majority Black cities. 0, right? You have no ability to control any portion of where you live. And let's juxtapose that with what white power looks like in a nation that is quickly becoming majority minority. For the last 90 years, every single state in America other than Hawaii has been majority Black, is majority white, and that is up until now. Now there are a couple where white people are the plurality, not the majority, but never minority. There are 7 states in the last census where white people were 90+% of the population. Nobody says anything about that being a problem for integration or segregation or anything. They control 14 Senate seats, an 1/8 of all the Senate seats in the Congress, in the Senate. No one says anything about that. If you widen that circle out to 85%, that number of states doubles. No one says anything about that. But they have that much power. And if you just look at the population of those first 7 states I was talking about, there are 4 times as many Black people in America as the combined population of those 4 states, those 7 states. They represent about 3% of the American population.
You know, this is your argument is the framing is very different than the framing for the initial Great Migration. I can talk about my family stories. When I asked my grandfather, who left the South, who left Florida in, I believe it was 1918 or so, why'd you leave? And he said, because the white folks had me running. He was ambitious. He was outspoken. He was a little bit of a rebel. And there were things that he wanted to do. And so that's how he ended up in Newark, New Jersey. He viewed it as an opportunity for personal achievement, personal advancement, as did so many who left. Your argument turns in a different direction, as I understand it. It's like the question is not just personal achievement; it is collective power. It is.
But also, your grandfather aside, the part of the push was white terror. Absolutely, yeah. It wasn't just people moving because they thought they would have a better opportunity to be ambitious. They were being.
Oh no, he was running. He was leaving. Right. Yeah.
So there's white terror, and there was a collapse of the cotton economy in many of the cotton states with the infestation of the boll weevil. Mm-hmm. So a large part of the economy that Black people participated in was collapsing, particularly the young men of the time. I say that what I'm saying is not dissimilar. That what the liberal states and cities in the North and West allowed to blossom while they were ignoring the fact that they had a race issue, they allowed militarism in policing to blossom underneath their noses. And so many of the most high profile cases in the Black Lives Matter movement do not happen in Selma or Birmingham or Little Rock or Greensboro. They happen in New York and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland. Mm-hmm. right? So that same sense of trauma, and you get what they call a kind of a passive conferred kind of a trauma because we have it on our phones now. You don't even need the scale of the lynchings of the South because it feels like it because you keep seeing Black men and women killed in the street.
Oh, it was.
So the terror is part of the push, and then the economic part. They had the boll weevil. We have a pandemic that is crushing the Black communities in northern and western cities far more than it is crushing Black communities in the South. And the second quarter of last year was when we shut down the entire economy, shut down the schools and everything. So I looked at Black unemployment in destination cities as opposed to southern cities. The Black unemployment rate in Chicago was 3 times the Black unemployment rate in Atlanta.
Now, how is the when people were moving from the South, and there was very much a sense of the escape, and sometimes it's pictured artistically, say in the Jacob Lawrence migration series, in which people were even as they moved to the train stations, they worried about law enforcement trying to actually keep people down south. And that was about power and maintaining economic posture. The story of the Scottsboro Boys, many believe that they were prosecuted not so much because of what they may have done, but because they were on the rails and that they were headed north when the power structure in the South wanted to keep them down. What you're proposing would be a challenge to the continuation of the power structure in the South. How do you think the reception will be for the African Americans who start to move in large numbers to the South?
I don't know what the particulars will be. I can't predict the future in that way. I will say, however, that this is a revolutionary proposition, and revolutionary acts are never not met with resistance or risk. Right, and so I keep coming back to the same point. You just have to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Either you want access to state power or you don't,
mm-hmm.
because you don't have to have it. You don't have to have it. But that's where mass incarceration is primarily a state and local issue. If you really want to do something about it, this is how you do it. The way that the criminal justice system interacts with you individually, well, most of those laws are state codes, criminal code written at the state level. You want to change that? You can change it. But you have to make a decision about whether or not this is something you want to do. And I am not promising a cakewalk, nor am I promising a utopia. If racial majorities produce utopias, racial control of power produce utopias, every white person in America would be prospering right now.
There's a fair argument to be made that racial oppression actually drives everyone's prospects down.
Absolutely.
Back to that in a second. But one of the things you mentioned that this would be a revolutionary act. But there is precedent for this act, is there not?
Absolutely. And it was not by Black people, but by young white people. In 1972, 2 young Yale law students write a paper called Jamestown 70 in a Yale Law Review, and they basically say to young hippies, they're protesting the Vietnam War, but they're getting nowhere because Nixon is still executing the war the way he wants to. He says, they say in their paper, you can't have a revolution the way you want to. You can't have an armed revolution that be put down. What you can do, though, is what they call radical federalism. You could take over a state, literally. And they proposed Vermont. And this just kind of was a little paper in a review until a more prominent writer picks it up, writes an article in Playboy. Yes, people read Playboy for articles. And he, under the headline, Take Over Vermont. And tens of thousands of young hippies, white people from the Northeast primarily, pack their things, move to Vermont. They don't always have places to live. Sometimes they sleep in fields, sometimes they create communes, but they change Vermont from one of the most conservative states in America to now it is literally one of the most liberal states in America. It is the state in 2008 that Barack Obama won his largest percentage of the white vote. They basically changed Vermont from New Hampshire into Vermont.
And so, and there's an economic component, right? They moved for, in other states. So they moved for purposes of changing, for political power and creating a different sort of social compact. But there have always been massive moves for economic impact.
Absolutely.
Big magnets right now, until perhaps recently, has been Silicon Valley, where you go there with a particular skill set if you want to have opportunity. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the economic opportunity of moving from north to south?
Well, first of all, cost of living is far lower, is far cheaper. Number two, when Forbes does its list of places where the Black middle class is thriving, the southern cities are half of that list. When you look at where the Black median household income is rising, the southern states dominate. When you look at places where Black-owned businesses or where you have the highest percentage of Black-owned businesses, that is the Southeast that ranks highest. It is not a utopia, as I said before. There are challenges everywhere. That's the whole. That's one of the premises of the book. Racism is everywhere. Struggle is everywhere. But you're in a better position if you live in a space that is not governed by white supremacy. And you're in a better position if you're in a space where you have enough power to impact the structures and architectures that oppress.
So let's dig a little bit deeper on the economic opportunity in the South. Why do you think it is that there has been this level of growth in the middle class and apparent opportunity?
Part of it is a rise of the Black political class in the South. Maynard Jackson becomes the first mayor of a major Southern city in 1973, and that was in part because Atlanta first becomes a majority Black city in 1970. But since Maynard Jackson, if you look around now, it is if you leave off Florida, you leave off Texas, both states that are not on my list of my reverse migration patterns.
My grandfather left Florida for probably the same reason. It's not on.
Exactly. But many, if not most, of the major Southern cities right now have Black mayors. Many of those cities are majority Black cities. That they have simply changed the political dynamic on the municipal level. Right now, 1/4 of all Black people in America live under Black municipal control. And when you do that, there are contracts you can give out. You can deal with tax structures and fines and what have you in your city. There's a lot that can go along with. Maynard Jackson created a whole class of Black millionaires here in Atlanta just through civic municipal policy.
Yeah, it's almost the reverse of what happened with the color of law and how policy led to inequality. And it's something that really, as we move forward, we have to address in a very, very serious way. So one of the issues about the economy in the South is that 7 of the 10 states in the country have the highest poverty rates are in the South. And so to a certain extent, that might undercut the argument that there is opportunity there. But I have a sense that, as you look at the data, you see something different.
I do see something different because what it disguises is how bad the situation is for Black people in northern and western destination cities, right? And so there are 2 metrics used. You're looking at raw poverty. Let's just look at that first, right? When Black people moved out of the rural South, they moved mostly into the urban North. So they moved into specific cities. There are very few places outside the big cities, New York, Syracuse, Chicago, Detroit, Flint, that Black people moved. It was concentrated in those cities. So you kind of have to compare the city poverty rates in some ways to what's happening in the South, right? Because what happens is there's a lot of poor white people in the South. And so that changes the average. I look at New York City. I don't know if this will be surprising to you or not. The Black poverty rate in New York City, which is 2 million Black people alone, which is more than some states have of all people, has a higher Black poverty rate than all of Mississippi. If you look at city to city, Jackson is the largest Black city in Mississippi. It just overtook blackest big city in America from Detroit. Detroit's poverty rate is something like 40%, black poverty rate, something like 40%. 80% of the people living in Detroit are poor. The black poverty rate in Jackson is 26%. When we look at just the state number, it disguises the fact that in these destination cities, people are not doing well at all. And the numbers that set the poverty rate is universal across the country. You might somehow make it on $17,000 in Mississippi. There is no way that you're making it on that $17,000 in New York City with the cost of living difference. There's no way. Now let's look at a second metric, which is concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty is infinitely more evil because it has much more deleterious effects. If concentrated poverty is when any community has a poverty rate of 40% or more. Basically, you're poor and everybody around you is poor. There is no one there to help lift the community. When you look at the municipalities with the highest concentrated poverty rate, there's only one southern municipality on the entire list, and that is in Tennessee, which is also not one of my target states. All the rest of those municipalities are in the North and West. In fact, Detroit, of the big cities, has the highest concentrated poverty rate in America. So it is impossible to argue that somehow people living in New York are living in Detroit, are living in Chicago, where the poverty rate is in the 30s, and not a single one of these southern states has a poverty rate that is above 20%. How can you even argue that?
Yeah, it's tremendously disturbing. And one question though, even about those 7 states, those are not states, right? So Georgia, you see a tremendous amount of progress in Georgia, and you also see a tremendous amount of African-American power in Georgia. It's not just a question of contracts, but it's also a question of policy. In those states that have the most severe policies as an aggregate, that is Mississippi and Louisiana, how would you characterize the levels of African-American power in those states?
Well, I think in the South in general, African-American power has been held hostage. You're roughly a third, just evening it out, of the population in all those states, but they haven't voted the way African-Americans voted in a presidential election in a generation, So that's a real thing. Also, I want to make sure that, because you said, again, Mississippi, Louisiana, the target states, the South is the biggest region in the country in terms of number of states. It is huge. And it stretches all the way to Delaware. A lot of people don't think of Delaware as a southern state, but the census does and always has. Delaware is also the 8th blackest state in America. So I want to make sure we're talking about the entire South. 9 states that I'm talking about. It includes Mississippi, it includes Louisiana, but it goes all the way up through Virginia, right, and Maryland and Delaware. So there's a lot of variety to the states that I'm talking about, both in terms of economics, power, policy, and also just geography in terms of what may be attractive to people who want to move to a target state.
So our children are about the same ages. My older daughter was in New Haven at Yale at about the same time your son, which I think she graduated the year before. They are still making choices about where they should land. What would you tell to that generation about which states they should go and how they would thrive there?
Yes. So what I'm saying to those young people, like your children and mine, is take everything into consideration. Sometimes you may have a career that is region or state specific, so that has to be taken into account. So then maybe it won't be reasonable for you. But there are some people who have careers that could be anywhere. And to those people who have that kind of freedom, who have yet to put down stakes and roots anywhere. They don't have a family yet. They haven't made a home purchase. They haven't committed to a job or career. You have the choice to be anywhere. You have to make a choice about how much power you want to be able to exercise over your life and over your children's lives. And also, and I say the children's lives because you have to remember that the Great Migration took place over 60 years. This is a generational undertaking. This is not like I show up in Georgia tomorrow and everything changes. I show up in Louisiana tomorrow and everything changes. You're doing this as much for your children as you are for you. 20 years from now, what do you want the reality for your children to be? What do you want the reality for yourself to be? Do you want to be in a space where you're still having to march every time a Black person is shot in the street? Do you want to be in a place that treats your culture as the spice of a city or a state rather than central culture to that city or state? Do you want to be able to have an influence on the textbooks from which your children read and learn, or don't you? Do you want to have some control and say over criminal justice policy and the writing of laws and what is a crime and what is not, and what degree of penalty will be applied or not? These are just fundamental questions. People may still say, yes, but I like being near, the culture of this city or that city. That's fine, make that choice. But I don't want anybody making these choices anymore without the knowledge that you have another choice.
So that I think is a nice tying off of the kind of myth busting that's in the book, but it also opens up something else, because you were talking about our children and the emotion both in this conversation, but also in when you write in your book. It is laced, the book to me is laced with love. It starts with your initial interview of Timuel Black in Chicago, and it is a chord that runs throughout the entire piece. What caused you? Why did you write this book, and how did love show up for you during the writing of the book?
Cool. That's such a tough question. So people have asked me this before. I do not know. I just know that I sat up one night and started writing a book proposal to see if I could write it, because I had been stymied for years, quite literally. My agent kept saying, you have to give me a book proposal. And I kept saying, oh yeah, working on it. And I wasn't working on it. But I know that this Vermont example was in my mind. How successful it had been, and how that it was constitutional and legal and doable, like infinitely doable. And they had done it. I think that probably was the biggest motivator for me. And once I started to write book proposal, I realized that I was drawing from columns that I'd written before. And it seemed like I had possibly been writing this book the entire time I've been writing a column. All of the arguments for migration were there, all the arguments against the myth busting you talk about Northern racism and Southern living. It was all things that I had touched on before. And so I wrote out of that. The actual writing of the book was difficult because I was trying to figure out, how do you frame this? I know that if this is my arrogance as a writer, but I always believe that if I can see something, I can describe it. Like I can write it. If I just let me see it happening or experience it, I can write that. How do I write about things that happened long ago? There's no way I can see it. I only read about it in old newspaper clips. And how do I make that sing? That was really my dilemma. But the more I wrote about it, and more I got into the research of it, I realized that there were people who I was talking to, that the scenes just of me talking or interacting with them was something that I could write in that way, that allowed you to be a real empathetic person in the room with me, in the car with me, with that person, and that's where it came from, I think.
I mean, there is just, in some of the writing, there is just fun, and sometimes you're just showing off. So when you were talking about the South and not excusing the South for its atrocities, you wrote, there exists in the region an architecture of endemic racial subjugation that its denizens refuse to relinquish, and that must be pried loose. And I said to myself as I read that, okay, he's having fun now. There's just a lot of joy just in the writing. And then the way you handle the arguments about progress. What you said was, there have been undeniable advances, but when barbarism is the base, the only way to move is up. And that was sort of a drop the mic kind of phrase in the book. So there is this, as for the reader, there is fun in just watching someone like you, excellent in your craft and seeming to enjoy the craft. But the other thing that comes through for me is this sense of empathy, but also a sense of things that are part of African American culture. So at the end of the book, you talk about your time with Tamir Rice's mom, and you talk about being in the house and the urn that contained his ashes near some toys. And you asked her the question, which a lot of people wouldn't think to ask her, which is, why did you have him cremated? Most people within the African American diaspora, cremation is unusual. More often than not, that people are buried, and like my family, we got multiple generations in one cemetery. But you thought to ask her that question, and why was that?
For the reason you explained, like, it's very rare for me to see cremation urns in any Black person's house. I don't know of very many Black. I'm trying to say if I know any Black people other than her that have cremated. So it is a question that immediately comes to mind. The other thing about Tamir Rice's mom, and I've interviewed many of the what they so-called mothers of the movement, people who are mothers to Black people who are slain by police. There is a common humanity to them that I immediately identify with. Many of them are working class or poor. They have, many of them, not all, they lived in rougher environments. And I immediately identify with that. Like I get, and I think that they sometimes see me coming and they say, oh my God, this guy from the New York Times is coming. And I immediately quell that. You don't have to worry about me coming to your house and listen, I grew up in houses and around houses where you could be inside in the winter and see outside, and it wasn't through a window. Like, it was like, I know poverty, and it does not freak me out. It is not a judgment on you. This is a condition people work through. People struggle. I've struggled. You do not have to be worried about the guy from the New York Times coming in bigfooting and judging. And they almost always immediately recognize that I see them too. And that was part of my experience with her. So she immediately saw that I could see her and that I wasn't there to exploit her. And so then the questions were easy to ask because I knew that our experience was a shared experience.
And her answer was, to me, powerful.
Yes, that she one day wanted to leave Cleveland because Cleveland had taken her child. But if she left Cleveland, she did not want to leave him there.
Mm-hmm. It is the things that you want to carry with you are really important. And she wanted to give him a different place, even in death.
Yes.
That is, it was for me a very moving chapter. So I think at this stage we are supposed to open it up for questions. The book, you can see it behind Charles. You can see it in my hand. The Devil You Know. It is. You don't have to tag your copy of the way.
Yeah, there are so many. Wait, and they're color coded.
It's they're not only color coded, the code actually matches the color of the cover. Get the book. It is worth the read. Have the myths busted. Reframe the way you think about how power is achieved. I could ask so many more questions of Charles, but it's now the audience's turn. So Ariel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. Okay, we do have a bunch of questions here. Allie wants to know, how can one person help to make positive change?
Oh, that's such a broad question. Yeah, it's almost too broad to answer. So I'll just pick a category on which I think that works. I always talk about your sphere of influence. Your sphere of influence is strongest, closest to you. This is your family, your friends. Think mostly about influencing people within your sphere. That's where you have the most power to make the most difference. Some people have bigger platforms and their sphere of influence is enormous. Most of us do not. And all that can be expected of us is to, in our closest interactions, to be consistent, to be a person of character, a person of ethics.
I couldn't agree with you more. Okay, so there are actually two questions from Barry, and they kind of go together. I certainly am intrigued by your premise, but how do you get around gerrymandering? Michigan, where I live, has voted majority Democrat for years, yet our state legislature is run by the GOP and Detroit suffers from it.
Well, the one thing that I'm discussing is state power, right? Which means that there are some things that gerrymandering will do, and they will do everything they can to decrease the power of your vote.
Right.
But on the state level, you have senators. That's a statewide election. Everybody in Michigan can live in Detroit, and they can't gerrymander that away. On the presidential level, that's a statewide election. Doesn't matter where you live, you can't gerrymander that. So you start with where you can make the biggest impact: Senate and presidential elections. If the numbers continue to increase, you will eventually get around to control of state legislatures. Right now, Georgia has had one of the biggest delegations of Black elected officials to the state legislature. They didn't take it over, but they added substantially to the state legislature Black state representatives. That's what you have to do. And if you can get it, also the governor is a statewide role. No matter where you live in the state, you will count. There's no gerrymander that can take that away. One thing, power that the governor has, if you can elect a governor, is that they can veto things, right? So then the hurdle becomes very high for them to be able to impose something on the majority of people that governor doesn't want imposed. Can they get a veto-proof majority? Yes, but it's a much, much higher hurdle than if they have a rubber stamp in the governor's mansion.
Right, and I think we've all seen what Stacey Abrams has been able to achieve in a state that was famous for gerrymandering, where you're living right now, or perhaps I should say infamous. So here's one from Lynn. So she wants to know, what are your target southern states, and are there any states outside of the South that can or should be targeted, e.g. minorities currently close enough to a plurality or majority?
So first I want to make sure that I clarify something. When I say Black power, that is exactly what I mean. It is not minority power. It is not people of color power. It is not majority power. It is Black power. And the reason that I say that is that because I am fighting a war on two extremes. On one end of the seesaw is white supremacy. On the other end is anti-Blackness. And majority, minority, or browning does not solve anti-Blackness. It is hard to find a society on the planet that has a difference in way people live, some darker people, some coarser hair, whatever, and some not. where the darker people in that society are not assigned the lower caste. So when we take immigrants from other countries, or they come from other countries, many people bring that same thing here. In fact, Black people themselves had been baptized in so much of this white supremacy that we had internal colorism within the Black community. Anti-Blackness is a global problem, and it is also an American problem, and Browning does not solve it. Minority coalitions do not solve it. There's one fallacy that we have to put down, which is that everyone who is non-white shares a shared set of values, a shared set of policy goals. They do not. If that were the case in 2016, a third of Hispanics and a third of Asians would not have voted for Donald Trump, but they did.
Okay.
And, yes, and in immigrant communities this time around, his support surged. They're just not. It doesn't solve the issue.
Okay. So, but I think the question, and I think that's really important, but the question that Lynn asked is interesting. So what are your target states?
Oh, the target states, yes. So it's 9 states. It stretches from Mississippi across I-20 and then up the I-95 corridor. So that is, I think hopefully I get them all. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. All states with between 25% and I think Mississippi's almost 40% Black populations.
So Todd asks a bunch of questions that are mostly about the conservatism or liberalism of the culture in the South. For example, how does the South compare to the North, where same-sex or interracial marriage is concerned? Where are most such white supremacist organization members located? They're sort of all adding up to that same question, if you see what I mean.
Okay, so I'll just give you a couple of stats on this. In the last census, the region of the country with the most gay parents was the South, right? Now, a lot of that was also a result of oppression, right? The people tried to get married first, and it didn't work out, and they realized later in life, okay, I'm gay and I just have to be gay, but they already had the children. But it has created in the South a culture in which gay parents are a thing. In addition to that, there are major southern cities with thriving gay communities. I live here in Atlanta, thriving gay community in Atlanta. And there is nothing anomalous about being gay in this part of the South. And there are other cities that are just as liberal. If you go to New Orleans, or, I could just list a number of cities. So that is a reality. Is this still the Bible Belt? Of course it is. But are there places where, and that's why I target bigger cities, are there cities all across the South that are inclusive? Absolutely, absolutely. The second question I think was about hate groups or something.
Yeah.
Hate groups, right? So the South has always been associated with the Klan. The Klan has shrank down to I think about 5,000 members now. There are only a few Klan groups. What is ascendant is neo-Nazism and white supremacy. Those neo-Nazi groups, and there are more of those in destination states than there are in the South. There are very few of these new neo-Nazi groups in the South, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Another study looked at web searches for racist terms. So this is, they don't know it. This is not assigned to a particular person. You're doing this in the privacy of your own home or on your phone. No one knows. This is great kind of surveillance data. The most searches were not in Deep South. They were up the spine of Appalachia all the way up into New York.
Okay. I'm surprised they weren't out west in Idaho and, which I've always thought of as kind of ground zero for white supremacist organizations, but maybe that's a population difference.
It could be that. Also, one point that I make is that white supremacy and kind of white violence is activated by proximity. That when you have very few Black people or other people in your presence, there's no need to oppress them because they're not there.
Right.
When Black people showed up in mass to northern and western cities, those cities that before then didn't have those same oppressive impulses began to be oppressive in much the same way that South had been before.
Just in the recent past, you see the within the last 5 months, the takeover of the State House was not in the South; it was in Michigan. And many of the source states of people who breached the Capitol, conducted the riot, threatened the vice president and the speaker, they were from all over. A large number came, in fact, from New Jersey.
Okay, here's one from Michael. I am a white 73-year-old and lifelong progressive. I remember when friends moved to Vermont in the late 60s and 70s, and remember how hard it was for so many as the object of hate by the conservative white population. Many moved back to New York City because they couldn't cope with the hatred. How will this dynamic be played out in the Black migration back to the South?
Again, I can't predict the future. I can say this, as I said before, it's a revolutionary act. It will not be without resistance. It will not be without risk. It will not be for everyone. Everyone doesn't migrate in any migration. Not everyone moved west with the gold rush. Not everyone moved west with the Dust Bowl. Not everyone who was in New York moved north into Vermont when that article was written. That's not how migrations happen. It happens among the most willing, the most durable, the most interested in doing it. Those are the people who I'm appealing to.
Right. And TL says, this is kind of a follow-up in a way. Is it possible for bad actors, for example, white supremacists or the racist faction in the silent majority, to misuse or abuse the reverse migration strategy?
I mean, well, anything's possible. In the beginning, you'll swell the ranks of red states, right? So the return won't come until a year, a decade. In the same way that the return swell the state of Georgia decade or two before it turned blue. So it just gave the two Republican senators here more power. It gave more allocations of resources to the state of Georgia, which was under both Republican control on the legislative level and in the governor's mansion, and was consistently voting for Republicans. So that is the trade-off. But in the end, what happens in Georgia? You get enough that you change the entire political complexion of the state. You have to play the long game. Republicans are playing the long game. There's a reason that they're stacking these courts.
Right. Okay. Carol says, I read the book. Can you speak more about Booker T. Washington and his impact?
Well, I mean, yeah, so Washington was hands down the most popular, important Black man of his time. And first of all, I believe that he was completely committed to the advance of Black people. He committed his entire life to it. I believe that his impulses were in the right place. I just think he made a terrible, terrible, terrible miscalculation in saying, and basically giving up or telling white America that Black people should give up the right to political power and focus on economics. Now, it is easy for me to sit here in a comfortable apartment in Atlanta and say that. Booker T. Washington was living through a natural catastrophe. It is estimated that a full quarter of every Black person in America after the enslaved were freed got sick or died. His own mother died in that period.
Wow.
people showed up to Tuskegee, the school that he sponsored. They had never slept in a bed. They didn't know he had to bring one thing with him, a toothbrush, because many of them had never seen or used a toothbrush. They had been kept in such savage conditions that he was seeing, his focus in, I just need to lift these people who have been dehumanized back up to their humanity. So it's kind of hard. I categorize it as a huge miscalculation. At the same time, I try to be empathetic because it is easy for me, a person not born into enslavement and born into relative comfort, to criticize someone who was living through a catastrophe of enormous proportions.
Well, Barbara has a question that kind of speaks to this. Income inequality has worsened since the 1970s. America has become more diverse, and typical individual bargaining power in the market is growing closer to sharecropping. So my question is whether Blacks and other Americans benefit more from enhancing individual rights or from concentrating Black voting power. It's a little confusing. Wait.
Yeah,
So,
I don't know how to answer that question.
okay, so I think what she's saying is that she's talking about how the gig economy, and she's saying that and she's talking about bargaining power, so I guess that's unions, right? So she's saying, does it really make sense to talk about concentrating Black voting power or enhancing individual rights?
As a Black person, to me, it makes absolute sense.
I'm not sure those two things are opposed.
Yeah, I don't think they're separable. They can be cleaved apart. I look around America and I see oppressive behaviors in these northern and western so-called liberal cities. I see stop and frisk bloom in New York City, which is supposedly one of the most liberal cities in America. And every time Quinnipiac asked the citizens of New York if they were okay with it, knowing that there was a negative, which it was negatively impacting Black and brown boys and men, but important to say boys because Bloomberg's lowest age on that targeting list was 16. A majority of white people in New York City every single time said they were fine with it. That means that you're not valuing my boys and my body in the same way that I want them to be valued. And so, yes, it absolutely makes sense to me that I want to live in a space where that sort of white supremacy does not prevail, where I have enough power to fight that as a policy and also as an attitude.
Right. So that's
there is no use for economic power if I am dead or if I am incarcerated.
Well, here you have someone who's completely won over. She says, Nancy says, my book club is reading the book in March. How do we start planning for our mass exodus?
You will be joining a lot of other people. I think there's something like 82,000 millennials alone, 2018 left the Northeast for Southern states. This is already happening. I was surprised by how many people I recognized from New York when I came to Georgia, and this was a pandemic. I can't even imagine how many people are actually here.
So Candace says, how has Mr. Blow's relocation to the South affected his thesis? So in other words,
Georgia became proof of concept when I moved here. Now, you know how books are written. I had to write the book proposal years ago. There was no way for me to foresee what was going to happen in Georgia. I chose Georgia, Atlanta, because it was easier for me in the work that I do. I still have work in New York, both at the newspaper and television. So I needed a place where I could move back and forth. So I had a list of cities. Georgia won out, Atlanta won out. But I had no clue that this was going to happen. But what happened this election cycle became proof in concept, only strengthened in my mind the proposition of the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Lisa says, I appreciate the argument for reverse migration is about gaining political power. However, what might that ultimately mean for the social structure in those northern cities? Without diversity, how will we ever learn to understand and appreciate each other?
Well, the highest percentage of Black people that ever in any state in the South, and therefore any state in America, was 61% of the population, and I think that was in South Carolina. So there was diversity. It's just that white people weren't the majority. And white people have a hard time seeing diversity as anything other than them being the majority and everybody else splitting the other percentage.
I think she's saying
no, but I'm saying this. I'm saying this. People want to live in a place like New York because it has other people, but those people don't have the power. If they don't have any political power, so they become the spice. Yes, I can go get a beef patty. I can go get Indian food, and I can go get Chinese food, and I can go get Puerto Rican food, and then I can come back to my enclave on the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side or in Greenwich Village, where almost no one else lives there but me, and want to call that diversity. That is not diversity. New York, Chicago, some of the most segregated cities in America. If you want to know how that segregation plays out, New York City's school system is one of the most segregated school systems in America because of that hyper-segregation among the population. But we want to look at that hyper-segregation because there are other people living around and say that that is diversity. It is not.
okay. So would you advocate, this is another question from Susan, would you advocate that Black people living in the South but not in one of your 9 states move to one of them, or stay and work for change where they are?
Move to the 9 states that I'm discussing.
Okay. So can you give us one word? Oh, okay, this I'm just going to skip this one. Sorry, it's just.
Master writer, he probably could give you one word.
Well, all right. I'm sorry. Can you give us
one cheat and get the thesaurus?
And of course, now I'm not going to be able to do it.
Well, I don't want to be controlling here. Can you give us one word to describe your reaction to the January 6th activity in DC?
Predictable.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I told you he could give you one word.
Would you like to?
Predictable and
predictable. Now you want more than one word.
And it was predicted.
Word.
And it was something that not only predictable, it was predicted. But that's another book talk.
Right. So every time white supremacy has felt threatened in American history, it has responded violently. Right. And whether that is the freeing of slaves and Black people getting majorities in the South, in some of those southern states, whether that be the imposition of Reconstruction, whether that be the advance of the civil rights movement, you name it. The backlash against it has been strong and very often violent.
There's no denying that. So Dwayne says, Charles, bearing conservative mindset in the Black community about the family and sexuality, how has your identity as a gay man informed your thesis?
I will say this, in the journey that most queer identified people traverse in life, there comes a moment of you have to do something that no one else has to do. You have a moment of declaration, which can be challenging, but it is necessary for your truth. And very often you lose friends, you lose families, but you do it anyway. When you have had to have that experience in your life, you no longer have space in your life for people who are half-stepping or not truthful or not engaged in things that are risky for the betterment.
That makes a lot of sense. Sherry says, achieving power requires having the vote. However, the southern states have historically and moving forward seem to favor voter suppression. How do you get around it?
Well, first of all, states all across America favor voter suppression. Look at Pennsylvania, neighbor to New York, one state over from New York, and you look at the overt voter suppression. As soon as they gutted the Voting Rights Act, Pennsylvania swooped in to pass a slate of voter suppression act. Look at the Midwestern states and all the voter suppression acts that they have tried to institute. Voter suppression is a national problem. Wherever conservatives think that they have a hard time winning, that is where voter suppression is raising its head. So,
Right.
right.
So this is an interesting question. This is from Barry. The Black poverty rate in Detroit is driven by the loss in manufacturing jobs. What are reverse migrants to do when we return?
It depends on what state you're going to. If you are in a part of the technology industry, there's a whole technology corridor on the Virginia kind of corridor where there's all kinds of technology companies. Many of the car manufacturers that no longer want to be in the Midwest are going to the South. BMW, some of them are foreign, clearly, but they're locating in southern states, in large part because of regulatory issues, but that is where they're going. So they're all the industry that made Detroit a bustling place is making the southern cities and states bustling, because that is where new car manufacturing is primarily being located in America.
Okay. Here's one by Sean. As we empower young adults to become more politically engaged, how do we restore civics back into the K-12 curriculum? Our youth do not understand the three branches of the federal government, or that city governments might have wards and others might have districts or boroughs. I am an advocate for Black power politically and economically.
Education policy is largely state policy. Again, it's back to the thesis. You want to change it, you increase your power in the state, or you take it over.
Okay, so we have Charles here. We have a little bit more time to ask some questions. I have a question. I just wonder, if, it's expensive to move.
Yes.
What about all of these like really poor people who are, being mistreated and downtrodden? How do they get it together to move? Is that something that you would want to try to organize, politically to help people to move?
Well, I think that grassroots organizations should be engaged in that. That's not my end of activism. That's theirs. But what I will say is this: when people move, when most of the people, particularly in the first part of the Great Migration, moved north, they were poor.
Mm-hmm.
Not only were they poor, many of them were without work. They were unemployed and poor. They moved to the north not knowing where they were going. Mm-hmm. Some of them never seen snow. Some of them never felt cold like that before. And most of them were young.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they weren't moving vans and vans and van loads of furniture. It was whatever they could pack onto a train.
whatever they could carry.
They went in, they came to Chicago and cities like that with literally what they could carry.
Here's another question that's interesting from Jennifer. My family is biracial. Where do we fit in? My husband is white and I am black. Our twin boys are mixed race. Would we be accepted in the states that you mentioned?
I don't even understand that kind of a question, because it presupposes that Black power is exclusionary power. And the only way to make that make sense is that you have to turn the glove inside out and say, in the majority white state that you live right now, New Jersey or New York, is that an exclusionary society? So why would a state that is 1 point over 50% Black be more detrimental to your family than one that is already majority white?
So she actually follows this up. She says, would my twin boys be shunned by Black folks or white folks?
What are they shunned by now?
Okay.
I think is the question trying to get at the climate in the current climate? Because I think, Charles, you went through data that showed that the climate, that it's not just a question of, say, having a gay parent that's a thing, but in terms of interracial marriage and other things, they are accepted in the South to the extent or more so than the North.
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
I think it's a question that's being asked here because Montclair is a magnet for interfaith, interracial, and gay families. So,
well, like I said before, the people who feel most comfortable, most affirmed, most protected, safe, and celebrated where they are should stay where they are. It is people who don't feel that, who feel unsafe, people who feel like their opportunities have dwindled and their hope is gone. Those are the people most likely to be open to migration. And those are the people who should migrate.
and that is kind of what happened with the Great Migration the other way. The people who, you said before, Jim, that your family ran from Florida. They were like, there's nothing for us here. We are leaving.
And many of the wealthiest,
for us.
many of the wealthiest Black families in the South, they didn't leave. They're like, why am I leaving my estate? Why am I leaving my estate to go live in shiver in Chicago? They didn't leave. So there are people who were very much established. They felt safe. They felt prosperous. They stayed. Those are decisions that individual people will have to make.
Right. Diane says, we saw how effective the get out the vote was in Georgia. Now we see action against Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock, accusing them of voter registration fraud. How do we protect activists who register voters from being targeted? I also wonder how to address the issue of additional barriers to voting, such as moving polling places and ID requirements.
I guess I will say this one more time. You're gonna have to fight. Power is never simply handed over to someone else on a platter with a nice, lovely note that says, take care of this, I'll be back. Doesn't work that way. They're gonna fight tooth and nail to retain the power that they have. You have to decide whether or not you think you want it. And if you want it, if you're willing to work for it, and maybe there is some sacrifice for it. I've heard this question a lot of times, and I think back to the Selma bus boycott and all of the sacrifices that people made during the civil rights movement. They wanted access to political power and the right to vote. They wanted equal treatment for them and also for their children and their families. And it cost. I think people look at propositions like this and try to figure out, what is the way that it costs me nothing to do this?
Or cost me least.
Yes. Right. You know, it is with least amount of effort, least amount of risk, least amount of resistance. That is not the way power works. That's why I keep saying, dig deep in yourself. Decide if you want it, because you don't have to have it. And in fact, as the decades tick on, you won't have it. And maybe that is what Black America wants. They want to live in this existence where we keep having to march for another slain body. And we keep having to be subject to another militarized police force in a supposedly liberal city, because liberalism and racial egalitarianism do not overlap completely. You can be for saving the environment and a women's right to choose and gay marriage and still be a white supremacist and still not be a racial egalitarian. That's just a fact. So you can live that existence. That's your choice. My objective in writing this book was to make sure that I did not pass from this moment and from this place without laying out that there is another option, and either you're going to choose it or you're not. That's on you. I have done my duty as an observer and a bearer of truth and a bearer of witness.
Todd says, would you consider your proposition as being a modern take on Garveyism?
Some people, you could say that, but Garvey, I think, you know, Garvey in the line with a lot of other people are white nationalists. I mean, I'm sorry, Black nationalists. They want a separate country within this country, right? They want the United States to give over part of America to, or whatever, or to go to another place, go back to, you know, all of those concepts take America out of the equation. I am not doing that. I call it Black regionalism. Not to be separate from America, but to be stronger within the country, to use many of the same measures of oppression that were used against Black people as part of their liberation. To use the Constitution, not to try to subvert it. That this is about liberty and not sedition. That I'm not asking for a carve out from the country and for it to be Black run and Black owned and Black governed, but rather for a region in which white supremacy and anti-Blackness are not governing principles.
Okay. Here's one from Julie. I was in Gwinnett County recently interviewing a Black Republican who is breaking ranks with his family. What insights do you have about why and how it's possible there can be a rise in Black Republicans at this particular moment in history?
Well, let me just say a couple of things about this. Number one, when I say Black power, I am not talking about Democratic Party power or any party power. It is about Black self-determination. I am a Black liberal. I would hope that I will be able to convince people that my way is the right way when I talk to them individually, but I am not trying to recruit more voters for Democrats. That is not my objective here. My objective is to have a space where white supremacy and anti-Blackness do not rule and where Black people can make up their own mind. And it is no different than the way white people in America operate right now, where about half of them vote for one party and half of them vote for another, and no one accuses them of being all turncoats. And so Black people now vote overwhelmingly, more than any other race or ethnic group, for Democrats. If there is some attrition among Black men or whatever, there may be some policies that appeal to them, but Democrats haven't won the white vote outright since exit polls were invented. They've come to a 50-50 split, but haven't won it outright. So when people complain about 14 or 15% of Black men voting for a Republican, when the majority of white people vote for those Republicans, I am just a little bit mystified by that.
Here's a question. It's also a big question, but I think it's an important one. Paul says, what's the best way to be a white ally?
Well, I want to just say this. That is not the central focus of this book.
Right.
I believe that in the summer, there was growth among some people. People bought a lot of books on anti-racism, There was enlightenment for some people. I am happy for everyone for whom that was a reality. I think that is a positive thing. I think that racism is a form of ignorance. It is anti-science, and therefore anybody who comes out of that is great. But this proposal, although open to allyship, does not depend on it. Everything that I have ever encountered in my life depended on convincing white people to see my humanity, convincing them that I was equal and therefore they should do something that recognizes that equality. I am tired of being in a pleading position, even to allies. If
What you're saying is, if you move into, if people follow your idea, they won't need allies so much because they'll have the power that they need together.
Yes, this proposal centers Black people's ability to solve a problem that bedevils the Black community on their own.
Okay.
People have been begging white people to fully see and realize Black equality for 400 years, and we are still in a stage of that begging. I don't want to be in a stage of that begging. I don't want to be in a stage where Black liberation is dependent on white people's evolution.
Right. So I'm gonna just take, I'm gonna say two more questions here. That we're running a little bit out of time when some of the questions are starting to repeat. So, and I think you've given us much to think about. So Laura says, Bettina Love says, the allies table is full, be a co-conspirator.
Okay. I like it.
And here's another one. How does the idea of global warming affect the decision-making to move to the south, hurricanes being the most concerning?
Yeah, so I took this into account to the degree that it was possible to take it into account. So none of this, not only do I identify states that I think people should move to, I identify actual cities in those states that I think are most prime for people moving to. None of them are on the coast. That was the first thing, because you didn't want to be in the places most affected by hurricane or sea level rise. For instance, I interviewed the mayor of New Orleans for the book. Most of that did not make it into the book, but it was part of that rationale. Like, I need to make sure you have a plan to deal with this. Otherwise, I can't, in good faith, encourage anybody to move to New Orleans, right? So that New Orleans did not make my list of cities. In addition to that, I looked at floodplain data to make sure that even among the cities that I was choosing, that I wasn't choosing those in river floodplains. Can't do anything about the heat. The heat's going to be what the heat's going to be. But when I look back at what the climatologists have, this region in America with for the last 6,000 years has been the most suitable for human habitation, which is basically a region in the south, the southeast of the United States. Most of the country it's about 12, 15 states. Most of the country was never in the most habitable region. So that region will move slightly north over the next generation or so. Most of America still will not be in that most habitable zone, but that doesn't mean that people don't live there. And the Constitution still guarantees those places 2 senators and a certain number of electoral college votes.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to end with this one because I think that this one speaks for all of us here. And this is Ayana, and she says, Mr. Blow, this is not a question. It's a note of gratitude. Thank you for writing this incredibly important book. Yours is the only proposal I'm aware of that can yield Black political power in the present, without relying on white majorities. As a Northern-born Black millennial, I am already planning a move to Atlanta as a result of reading your book. See you there.
Thank you.
So, Charles and Jim, thank you so much for coming to Open Mind. And this was a really exciting discussion. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming today, because without you, we got nothing. And I want to repeat that The Devil You Know is available for sale by our partner, Watchung Booksellers, and it's also available to borrow through the library. And although we at the library are all about giving it away, I will say that if you care about the authors who come on this series, like Charles Blow, please consider buying their books and supporting them, because that keeps them writing the books and coming back and being able to share their great ideas with us. Finally, we hope you'll be able to join us for our next event, Isabel Wilkerson, in conversation with Rachel Swarns about her groundbreaking #1 bestseller Cast on Monday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. The program is sold out, but we do expect cancellations, so check back on the day of the event. Be well, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks again.
Take care.
Okay, we're done.